The quiet snowstorm. The wind howled like a hungry wolf outside David's small igloo. Snow swirled in the dark, blanketing the frozen wasteland in thick, icy sheets. The storm had been raging for hours, and David sat by the flickering fire, wrapped in heavy furs. His hands held an old, worn-out book, though he had read it countless times before. David had lived alone in this icy wilderness for nearly 2 years, far from cities, far from people. His only company was the crackling fire and the quiet hum of the wind. He didn't mind the loneliness. Out here, no one bothered him, and he could think in peace. But tonight felt different. The air was heavy, as if something unseen lingered beyond the walls of snow. David tried to ignore the feeling, brushing it off as nothing more than his imagination. Then it happened. A faint knock. David froze. The knock came again, soft but clear. It wasn't the sound of snow or ice shifting. It was deliberate, like a hand tapping gently against the igloo's entrance. David's heart pounded in his chest. No one came this far into the wilderness. There were no nearby villages, no travelers, and no one would survive in this blizzard for long. Slowly, David set the book aside and stood. The fire cast long shadows on the icy walls as he moved toward the entrance. Gripping the flap tightly, he hesitated. What if it was a wild animal? Or worse, someone desperate enough to do anything for shelter? Taking a deep breath, David pulled the flap open. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. The wind slapped his face, biting through the fur-lined hood he wore. But then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. A figure stumbled forward, collapsing into his arms. David barely managed to catch her. She was tall, slender, and wrapped in what looked like torn, shimmering fabric. Her skin glowed faintly, almost as if lit from within. Snow clung to her hair, which sparkled under the faint light from his fire. David quickly pulled her inside, shutting the flap behind him to keep the cold out. The woman trembled violently in his arms, her breathing shallow. He lowered her gently to the floor near the fire, wrapping her in thick blankets. Her face was pale, too pale. Her skin had an almost glass-like quality, smooth and cold to the touch. David placed his hand on her forehead. She felt icy, far colder than anyone should be. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, leaning closer. The woman's eyes fluttered open. Her irises shimmered like crystals, reflecting the fire's glow. She stared at him for a long moment, as if struggling to understand where she was. "Warm, need warm," she whispered, her voice soft and fragile. David grabbed another blanket and tucked it around her. The fire crackled louder, and he hoped the heat would help. "Who are you?" he asked gently. The woman's eyes flickered to his face, but she didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes again, curling deeper into the blankets. David could see her chest rise and fall in slow, steady breaths. He sat down nearby, watching her carefully. She looked human, but something about her didn't feel right. Her glowing skin, her strange clothes, and the way her eyes shimmered like jewels. None of it made sense. David glanced at the igloo's entrance. The snowstorm continued outside, but the quiet knock that had led him to her still echoed in his mind. Who was she? And what was she doing all alone in the middle of this frozen wasteland? David shook his head. Questions could wait. Right now, she needed warmth, and he needed to make sure she survived the night. He added more wood to the fire, the flames growing brighter. The light danced across the igloo's walls, casting flickering shadows over the sleeping woman. David sat back and watched as the storm howled outside. But inside, the igloo was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the mysterious stranger who had stumbled into his life. As the night stretched on, David couldn't shake the feeling that this woman, whoever she was, had brought more than just the cold with her, stranger in the warmth. The fire flickered, casting soft orange glows across the icy walls of the igloo. David sat quietly across from the woman, watching her as she lay bundled in blankets. The storm outside hadn't eased. The wind still howled like a restless spirit. Snowflakes pressed hard against the igloo's outer walls, but inside, the fire kept them both cocooned in fragile warmth. David stirred the pot of melting snow over the flames, occasionally glancing at his unexpected guest. The woman's skin was no longer as pale, and the faint glow beneath her skin seemed to pulse gently, like the soft hum of distant stars. His thoughts raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? Nothing about her made sense. Her strange clothing shimmered under the fire's light, and now that she was wrapped in his spare coat, David could still see the faint iridescent glow along her wrists and neck. No one lived in this frozen region for miles. No travelers. No explorers. Just endless ice and silence. And yet, here she was, as if the storm had carried her from another world and laid her gently at his doorstep. A soft cough broke his thoughts. David looked up. Her eyes were open now, fully awake. The deep blue of her irises caught the firelight, making them shimmer like frozen lakes beneath a winter sky. She sat up slowly, still clutching the thick blanket around her shoulders. Her gaze met his. "You're awake," David said softly, leaning closer. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if the words took longer to process. Her lips parted, but at first, no sound came. Then, in a soft, unfamiliar accent, she spoke. "Warm. Thank you." David's eyes narrowed slightly. The words were simple, but something about the way she said them felt foreign. It wasn't the pronunciation. It was as if she had learned the words only moments ago. He nodded. "You were freezing when I found you. I wasn't sure you'd make it through the night." She lowered her gaze to the fire, as if the flames had drawn her full attention. The way she watched the flickering embers was almost childlike, fascinated, as though she had never seen fire before. David noticed her fingers tremble slightly as she stretched them toward the heat. He hesitated, then poured hot water into a small tin cup, offering it to her. "Here, drink. It's not much, but it'll help." She reached for the cup but paused, staring at it with curiosity. Her fingertips brushed against the edge, but she didn't lift it right away. You drink this?" she asked, tilting her head. David raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, it's just hot water. It'll keep you warm." The woman hesitated, then carefully lifted the cup with both hands, blowing softly over the surface. David watched closely. Her hands, though delicate, bore faint marks along the knuckles, almost like tiny crystalline patterns that shimmered when the fire caught them. After a small sip, she lowered the cup, her expression softening. "It's warm," she whispered, almost to herself. David gave a small nod but said nothing. For several minutes they sat in silence, the fire crackling softly between them. Finally, David leaned forward, his curiosity too strong to contain. "I have to ask," he began carefully, "how did you end up out here? Alone?" Her eyes lifted to meet his again, but this time, a shadow crossed her face. She glanced toward the entrance of the igloo, the snow piling high just beyond the flap. For a brief moment, David thought he saw something else in her eyes. Not just caution, but fear. She began, but the words faltered. Her hands tightened around the cup. David watched her closely. She was clearly holding something back. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm. "I'm not here to hurt you, but I need to know, is someone looking for you?" Her grip on the cup trembled slightly. "They might be," she replied softly. David's brow furrowed. He glanced again toward the entrance, feeling the cold draft seeping in through small cracks in the igloo's walls. "Who's they?" he pressed. She opened her mouth but hesitated. Then, carefully choosing her words, she whispered, "I can't say. Not yet." David sighed but didn't push further. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flickered nervously toward the faint sounds outside. Whoever, or whatever, she was hiding from, it was clear she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he shifted the conversation. "What's your name?" The woman's eyes softened. For a moment, Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Lyra." David nodded. "I'm David." Lyra gave a small nod in return, though her eyes still carried shadows of caution. Another gust of wind rattled the entrance flap, and Lyra flinched slightly. David didn't miss it. "You can rest here as long as you need," he said gently. "The storm isn't letting up anytime soon." Lyra's gaze lingered on him for a few seconds longer, as if measuring the truth behind his words. Eventually, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered again. David leaned back, poking at the fire to keep the flames alive. As the night deepened, David's mind buzzed with unanswered questions. But one thing was certain. Lyra wasn't just a lost traveler. There was more to her, and whatever she was running from. David had a sinking feeling it was still out there, waiting in the snow. The truth beneath the snow. The storm had quieted by morning, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The soft crackling of the fire inside the igloo was the only sound, yet David couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the air. Lyra sat near the fire, wrapped tightly in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the small window carved into the icy wall. Outside, the sky was a pale, endless gray, blending into the frozen horizon. Her posture was tense, shoulders drawn up as if she expected something, or someone, to emerge from the snow at any moment. David watched her carefully from the other side of the igloo. He was no stranger to quiet guests, but Lyra's silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the silence of someone carrying weight too heavy to share. "You've been staring out there for an hour," David said, breaking the quiet. "Storm's past. Whatever you're looking for, I don't think it's coming." Lyra's gaze didn't shift. Her fingers curled tighter around the blanket. "They always come after the storm," she said softly. David frowned. "They?" he repeated. Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, David thought she might brush off the question like she had the night before, but instead, she sighed, long and slow, like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. "I didn't end up here by accident," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. David leaned forward, listening carefully. "My ship, it crashed." David blinked. "Ship?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time, David saw something more than fear, something deeper, like regret or grief. "Not the kind you're thinking of," Lyra said quietly. "It wasn't built here." David's heart skipped. He opened his mouth, ready to ask the obvious, but Lyra continued. "I escaped," she said, her gaze drifting back to the snow outside. "From them." David sat in silence, letting her words sink in. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the calm way she said it, or the fact that he believed her. "Who are they?" David finally asked. Lyra's grip on the blanket tightened. "Hunters," she whispered, "not from this world. They follow survivors like me. When they find us, they take us back, or worse." David's eyes narrowed. His instinct was to dismiss it as impossible, but the way Lyra spoke left little room for doubt. He shifted, glancing at the entrance of the igloo. Outside, the snow stretched endlessly in every direction, undisturbed except for the faint footprints Lyra had left the night before. "If they're looking for you," David said carefully, "won't they find us here?" Lyra shook her head, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "They don't always find survivors immediately," she said. "Sometimes they wait. They let the cold do the work for them. But if the storm didn't stop me, they'll know I'm still alive." David's stomach tightened. He'd heard strange stories from other researchers, tales of unexplainable lights in the northern skies, of missing teams who had vanished without a trace. He had never paid them much attention, until now. He glanced back at Lyra. "You're saying there's more of you. Survivors." Lyra nodded faintly. "Not many. Most don't make it this far." David exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what happens now?" he asked. Lyra's eyes darkened. "I keep running," she said simply. David studied her carefully. There was no trace of weakness in her voice, only quiet acceptance. She had been running for a long time, and from the look in her eyes, she had no intention of stopping. But something didn't sit right with David. "You're freezing," he said. "Your ship's gone. And if those hunters are still out there, how exactly do you plan to keep running?" Lyra hesitated. "I'll figure something out." David frowned. "That's not much of a plan." Her gaze shifted, lingering on him for a few moments longer than before. "I didn't expect anyone to help," she admitted softly. "I'm used to surviving alone." David crossed his arms, leaning back against the igloo's wall. "Well, lucky for you, you're not alone anymore." Lyra's eyes softened, but the flicker of gratitude was brief. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "If they find me here, they'll find you too." David shrugged. "Guess I'll take my chances." The two sat in silence, the fire between them crackling faintly. For the first time since Lyra had arrived, David noticed her shoulders relax, just slightly. Outside, the snow stretched endlessly, hiding whatever dangers lay beyond the horizon. But inside the igloo, for now, there was warmth. Uninvited visitors. The wind had died down by late afternoon, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. David stepped outside the igloo, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, white, empty, and quiet. But something about that quiet didn't sit right. He squinted at the horizon, shielding his eyes from the glare bouncing off the ice. The sky was a pale, muted blue, with no sign of movement. Yet the unease from earlier hadn't left him. Behind him, the igloo's entrance flap rustled gently, and Lyra emerged, wrapped tightly in the heavy coat David had given her. Her crystalline eyes scanned the landscape with the same cautious intensity that David had. "Storm's gone," David said, glancing at her. "Looks like we made it through the worst of it." Lyra didn't respond. Her gaze stayed locked on the distant snowdrifts, as if she expected them to shift at any moment. "They won't come during the storm," she said softly. "But afterward, that's when they move." David frowned. "You're sure about that?" Lyra nodded, her expression hard. For the first time, David noticed the way her hands subtly trembled, not from cold but from something deeper, anticipation, maybe even fear. He had seen that kind of look before in soldiers returning from war. David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "How do you know they're even out there?" "Maybe they gave up." Lyra's gaze flickered toward him, and for a brief second, something unreadable passed across her face. "They don't give up," she said flatly. David exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. "All right," he said, scanning the horizon once more. "Then we keep watch. If something shows up, we'll deal with it." Lyra's lips parted as if to protest, but she said nothing. Instead, she returned to the igloo, leaving David alone to stand guard. By the time night fell, the cold had sharpened. David sat near the igloo's entrance, cradling a lantern as the flames inside the structure flickered softly. Lyra sat nearby, her knees drawn up to her chest. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was fragile, like glass that could shatter at the slightest sound. David shifted, casting her a sidelong glance. "So, these hunters," he began slowly, keeping his voice light. "What do they look like? Am I watching for people? Animals? Something worse?" Lyra hesitated, then met his gaze. "They don't look like anything," she said. "Not at first." David's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "They hide." Lyra continued. "They use the cold. You won't see them until they're close." David's grip on the lantern tightened slightly. "Great. So they could already be out there, and we wouldn't know." Lyra didn't deny it. A heavy pause settled between them. David shifted uncomfortably, casting another glance toward the igloo's entrance. "Why do they want you so badly?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Lyra stared into the fire, the orange glow reflecting in her eyes. "It's not just me," she said softly. They hunt all of us. Those who survive the crash. The others didn't make it this far. David leaned forward slightly. So you weren't alone. Lyra shook her head. Not at first. David let the weight of her words hang for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. Lyra's gaze lifted to his, and for the first time, David saw something different. Gratitude, perhaps. Thank you, she whispered. David nodded but said nothing. It was close to midnight when David first noticed the lights. He had been dozing lightly, seated near the entrance, when a faint glimmer caught his attention through the small window of ice carved into the igloo wall. At first, he thought it might be the reflection of the moon against the snow, but the lights flickered, blue, faint, and moving. David straightened, his pulse quickening. Lyra, he whispered sharply. She was awake instantly, rising to her feet in one fluid motion. David pointed toward the window. There. See that? Lyra approached, her eyes narrowing as she peered through the small opening. Her face immediately darkened. They found us, she said under her breath. David's stomach twisted. What do we do? Lyra took a step back, her voice calm but firm. Extinguish the fire. Now. David hesitated for only a second before grabbing snow and smothering the flames. The igloo plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow from the lantern. Lyra crouched near the entrance, listening intently. Outside, the lights grew closer, weaving through the snow like ghostly figures drifting silently over the ice. David's breathing slowed as he strained to listen. There were no footsteps, no voices, just the eerie hum of the wind. Stay still, Lyra whispered. David followed her lead, barely daring to breathe. The lights passed by the igloo, hovering no more than 20 feet away. For a brief moment, David caught a glimpse of something. Tall, slender shapes moving beneath the glow, their forms blurred as if hidden beneath shifting layers of snow. They lingered near the igloo for several agonizing minutes before continuing into the distance, vanishing into the dark. David exhaled shakily. They're gone, he whispered. Lyra didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the entrance. For now, she replied. David's skin prickled. This wasn't over. Growing connection. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of a lantern to push back the shadows inside the igloo. David sat cross-legged on the cold floor, turning a small, worn knife in his hands. Across from him, Lyra remained wrapped in silence, her gaze distant and unfocused, as if she were listening to something far beyond the walls of snow around them. Outside, the night stretched on, but David could no longer tell how much time had passed. The lights, the hunters, had moved on, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. It pressed down on the small space between them, heavy and unrelenting. David finally broke the silence. You've been quiet for hours, he said, his voice low. I'm starting to think you might disappear if I blink too long. Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm still here, she replied softly. David leaned back against the wall, the cold seeping through his coat. Good. I was getting used to the company. She didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, she spoke again, this time more thoughtfully. Company isn't something I've had in a long time. David studied her carefully. There was something guarded in the way she held herself, as if she were afraid that letting her guard down, even for a moment, might cost her everything. How long have you been running? David asked, shifting the knife idly between his fingers. Lyra's gaze dropped to the floor. I stopped counting, she admitted. After the first year, it all blends together. Every place feels the same, every sky, every night. The cold helps, but not enough. David's grip on the knife tightened slightly. A year. You've been on the run for that long. Lyra nodded faintly. David exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know how you managed that alone. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, David caught something flickering beneath the surface. resilience, hard-earned and unwavering. I had no choice, she said simply. David opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to someone who had spent over a year living with the fear of being hunted? Instead, he shifted the conversation. You said you weren't the only one who survived. The others, were they like you? Lyra hesitated, as if the question stirred memories she wasn't sure she wanted to recall. They were different, she said finally. Some stronger, faster. Others, gifted in ways I'm not. We weren't all the same. I think that's why they separated us after the crash. David frowned. Separated. Lyra nodded. The hunters don't take everyone at once. They pick us off slowly, one by one. It's easier that way. David shifted uneasily, his thoughts circling. So why are they after you specifically? He asked. Lyra's eyes darkened slightly. I don't know, she said, though something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she had told herself that lie enough times to almost believe it. David narrowed his gaze but didn't press further. He wasn't sure he wanted the full truth just yet. Instead, he set the knife down beside him and leaned forward. Well, they didn't take you this time, he said, his tone light. So that's something. Lyra's expression softened. For now, she replied. David gave her a crooked smile. You're really into that whole pessimistic survival thing, aren't you? For the first time since she had stumbled into his life, Lyra laughed. It was quiet and brief, but it felt genuine. The sound warmed the air around them, if only for a moment. I guess it's easier not to hope, she admitted. That way, if things go wrong, it doesn't hurt as much. David's smile faded slightly, and he nodded in understanding. I get that, he said quietly, but I think sometimes it's worth hoping, even if it hurts. Lyra didn't respond right away, but David saw something shift in her eyes. For the first time, she seemed less like a fugitive and more like someone searching for something, perhaps not just safety, but something deeper. The lantern flickered softly between them, casting faint shadows across the walls. Lyra watched the flame for a long time before finally breaking the silence. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David glanced at her, confused. For what? For not asking me to leave. David shrugged, leaning back against the icy wall. Well, I figure if I'm going to have a mysterious alien fugitive hiding in my igloo, she might as well be good company. Lyra smiled again, and this time it lingered. Outside, the snow stretched endlessly beneath the dark sky. But inside the igloo, for the first time in years, David didn't feel so alone. The final escape. The igloo felt smaller as the night stretched on, its fragile walls barely separating David and Lyra from the endless expanse of ice and shadow outside. The lantern's flame flickered faintly, dancing across Lyra's face as she sat quietly near the entrance, her gaze distant. David watched her from across the small space, his mind racing with the weight of her words. Hunters, ships, crashes, the kind of things he'd only read about in strange conspiracy magazines left behind in remote outposts. But now one of those stories sat right in front of him, wrapped in his spare coat. The uneasy quiet between them shattered when Lyra's head snapped toward the entrance. Her crystalline eyes narrowed, and she rose swiftly, standing just beside the flap of the igloo. David tensed. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes locked onto something David couldn't see, her breathing shallow. After a long pause, she whispered, They're here. David's blood ran cold. You're sure? Lyra nodded slowly, her body rigid with instinctive tension. For a few moments, David heard nothing, just the distant whistle of the wind sweeping across the snow. But then, faintly, he caught it. A low hum, distant but growing louder, vibrating beneath the icy ground. It wasn't natural. He grabbed his coat and quickly pulled it on. We need to leave. Now. Lyra's eyes flickered with hesitation. You don't understand. They don't stop hunting. David pulled his pack from the corner, hastily shoving supplies inside. "I'm not waiting around to see if that's true." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. David grabbed his knife and handed her the lantern. "Stay close to me. There's a ravine about a mile from here. If we make it there, we can hide." Lyra nodded, tightening the coat around her shoulders. David pushed open the igloo's flap carefully, stepping into the icy air. The cold slapped him immediately, biting through his clothes. Lyra followed silently, her steps light and soundless on the snow. The landscape was eerily still. The pale moon hung low over the frozen expanse, casting faint shadows across the endless white. But just on the horizon, David saw them. Faint blue lights weaving slowly across the ice like distant will-o'-the-wisps. David's heart pounded. "Come on," he whispered. They moved quickly, footsteps muffled by fresh snow. The ice crunched beneath David's boots, and every sound felt louder than it should have. Lyra's breathing was steady beside him, but David noticed the way her gaze flicked over her shoulder every few seconds. "How long until they get closer?" David asked as they trudged forward. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Soon." David clenched his jaw and pressed on. The ravine wasn't far, but with the hunters closing in, even a mile felt like a dangerous stretch of open ground. The low hum grew louder, vibrating through David's bones. His grip tightened around the knife strapped to his belt. "We're almost there," he said, more to himself than to Lyra. Suddenly, Lyra froze, her hand shooting out to grab David's arm. "Wait," she hissed. David halted, eyes darting toward her. "What?" She pressed a finger to her lips, pointing toward a cluster of ice formations ahead. David squinted, his breath catching in his throat. Shapes moved. Tall, slender silhouettes gliding between the snowdrifts, their forms barely visible beneath shifting layers of ice. "Go around," Lyra whispered. David nodded, leading them in a wide arc away from the figures. His pulse hammered in his ears. The shapes didn't follow, but David could feel their presence, as if unseen eyes watched every step they took. As they approached the edge of the ravine, David finally exhaled in relief. "There," he said, pointing toward a narrow path leading down into the jagged trench below. Lyra hesitated, staring down into the shadowy crevices. "It's not safe," she murmured. David glanced behind them. The lights were drawing closer. "Less safe up here," he pointed out. Lyra's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but after a few moments, she nodded and followed him down the narrow path. The descent was treacherous. David's boots skidded over loose ice, but he steadied himself, gripping the rocks for support. Lyra moved more gracefully, stepping lightly across the slippery terrain. At the bottom, they huddled against the side of the ravine, hidden beneath an overhang of ice. David extinguished the lantern, plunging them into near-total darkness. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The hum faded slightly, but David could still sense the presence lingering above them. Lyra leaned against the rock, her breath visible in the cold air. "You didn't have to come with me," she said softly. David met her gaze. "Yeah, well, I'm not great at leaving people behind." A faint smile tugged at Lyra's lips. "Thank you," she whispered. David shifted, his hands trembling slightly from the cold. "Let's just hope they don't find us down here." Lyra's gaze drifted upward, toward the icy sky overhead. "If they do, we'll make sure they regret it." David chuckled under his breath. "I like the sound of that." As the wind howled above the ravine, David leaned back against the icy wall, feeling the weight of Lyra's presence beside him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. A new beginning. The first light of dawn crept over the frozen horizon, bathing the snow in pale gold. The sky stretched endlessly, a quiet canvas of soft blues and fading stars. David leaned against the icy wall of the ravine, his breath fogging in the cold air. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he forced himself to stay alert, watching the landscape for any sign of movement. Beside him, Lyra sat cross-legged on a patch of smooth ice, gazing up at the sky. Her expression was distant, lost somewhere far beyond the snow and stone. The faint glow beneath her skin had faded overnight, but the crystalline shimmer in her eyes hadn't dulled. For the first time since she arrived, she looked calm. David exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the handle of his knife. "They haven't come back," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Lyra's gaze lowered to the horizon. The blue lights, the hunters, had disappeared hours ago, swallowed by the cold expanse. But David knew better than to believe they were gone for good. "They will," she replied, her voice soft but certain. David frowned, shifting his weight to get a better view of the landscape. The snow stretched unbroken in every direction, except for the jagged line of the ravine cutting through the ice like a scar. "How long do we have?" he asked. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traced the distant mountains, barely visible through the mist. "Not long," she said finally. David sighed, rubbing his hands together to stave off the cold. "I guess I should be grateful for the break," he muttered. Lyra's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You're handling this better than most." David raised an eyebrow. "Most people don't have alien hunters chasing them through a blizzard," he said dryly. Lyra chuckled softly, but the sound faded quickly. Her gaze shifted downward, lingering on the snow at her feet. "I should leave," she said after a long pause. "The longer I stay, the more danger I bring to you." David stiffened slightly. "That's not happening," he said firmly. Lyra's eyes met his, uncertainty flickering beneath their crystalline surface. "You don't understand," she said. "They're not just looking for me. If they find you with me—" "I know," David interrupted, "but I'm not letting you walk out there alone." Lyra's expression softened, but the shadows in her eyes remained. "I've been alone for a long time," she said quietly. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Well, maybe it's time that changed." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft whistle of wind through the ravine. Lyra watched him carefully, as if trying to read something hidden beneath his calm exterior. "You could leave," she said. "Go south, away from the storms. You don't have to stay out here." David smiled faintly. "I left the world behind for a reason," he said. "Out here, things make sense. The cold doesn't lie to you." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "And now?" David's gaze drifted toward her, lingering for a moment before he answered. "Now," he said, "things just got a little more interesting." Lyra laughed quietly, shaking her head. "You're strange," she said softly. David grinned. "Takes one to know one." Another silence followed, but this time it felt lighter, like the weight between them had shifted. Lyra's eyes lifted to the sky again, and David caught a flicker of something in her expression. Hope, perhaps, or something close to it. "Is there somewhere safe for you?" David asked after a while. Lyra's smile faded. "There was," she said, "but not anymore. The crash changed that." David frowned. "Then what's the plan?" Lyra hesitated. "I have to keep moving," she said. "Eventually, I'll find a way off this world." David leaned back against the ice, staring at the rising sun. "Maybe you don't have to do that alone," he said casually. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't even know what you're getting into." David shrugged. "I know enough." For a long time, Lyra didn't respond. But when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, carrying something fragile beneath the words. "Thank you," she whispered. David met her gaze, nodding once. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. The wind carried their words away, scattering them across the snow like fragile glass. As the sun rose higher, the ice sparkled beneath its light, and for the first time in years, David felt something stir within him, a flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time, that felt like enough.